this election at least stops the bleeding. It allows us to shift and remind the world and ourselves of what we stand for. Yeah, I've got a lot of gray hair. I've said this publicly before. I am very fond of Angela Merkel. She is, I think, been an outstanding leader.
Mr. President, it's an honor.
Thank you so much.
How are you feeling after the victory of your brother, as you call him, Joe Biden? And are you relieved? Are you full of joy? Or are you worried of the road ahead?
Well, I think all of the above. It's no secret that I have been deeply troubled by the direction of our government under the current president. I am confident about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris being able to redirect our path back towards some of the values that not only were reflected in my administration, but I think are what has made America a leader around the world. You know, a respect for the basic ideals of human rights and democracy and rule of law. The alliances that we've had with our allies in NATO, and the belief that we have responsibilities around the world to promote democracy and human rights and free speech, not embracing dictators. So in many ways, I'm optimistic about the country's direction, but I also have to recognize from the results of the election that America remains deeply divided, that we have not solved, and I write about this in my book, we haven't solved this basic division here in the United States, and I think one that is echoed in Europe and elsewhere. There are those who are embracing a multicultural world in which we have to learn to accept and work with each other, and those who are fearful of change and have reacted with nationalism and oftentimes look to strongmen and authoritarian figures. And that contest of ideas, I think, is still being fought, and we're still going to have to find better ways to respond.
The president is not conceding. There's no transition. There are no intelligence briefings for the president-elect. Do you consider this to be an attack on democracy by a man who attacked you and started his political career, actually, attacking you, claiming that you weren't born in the United States?
I think it is predictable. Donald Trump is somebody who has signaled that he doesn't respect many of these basic norms that in the past Republicans and Democrats have observed. I write about in my book, when I came in to office in 2008, I had deep disagreements with George W. Bush, but he could not have been more gracious and helpful in assuring a peaceful transition of power. Donald Trump's unwillingness to perform that basic democratic role, I think, is going to make it more difficult for the Biden administration to hit the ground running to deal with a major pandemic and the economic crisis that's gone with it. But I also think that one way or another, whether it's done graciously or whether it's done grudgingly, we will have a new president on January 20th, and the country will move forward.
In your book, you also emphasize very often the value of youth, and you have a huge appeal to young people and their ideas, and you talk about fresh starts, and especially also about young leadership. Joe Biden isn't necessarily a young leader What does he need to do to succeed? Also considering his age.
Yeah, well, you know what? I'm not young anymore either. You know, yeah, I've got a lot of gray hair. But you know, I think that what Joe and Kamala share with me is a confidence in young people having a voice that needs to be heard, that we want to encourage their participation in our democracy, that we want them to know that they are important and that they have power and that their vision is worthy of attention and should be translated into political power and policy. So, you know, let's take the example of climate change. I don't think Joe would be offended to say that he will not be on this earth when we see the worst ramifications of climate change. Neither will I. It'll affect our children. It'll affect our grandchildren. And so you don't have to be a young person. You just have to care about young people and future generations to say that it's time for us to take much more seriously this existential threat that we all face. And I know that Joe will be committed to re-entering the Paris Accords. He will be committed to reversing some of the executive orders that Donald Trump took to lessen our commitment to curbing greenhouse gases. And I know that many of the young people who will be working in his administration are some of the same people who started off in my administration and helped to inspire me and focus me on these issues.
But you also write, and this is something that he will have to deal with, making compromises isn't rewarded by American voters. It showed again and again. So what can we do or what can the American people do to learn again to make compromises?
We have two different types of problems in terms of our politics. One problem is the machinery of government, our system, has gotten a little creaky. It needs a tune-up. And I write extensively in the book about what some of the structural barriers to government are in the United States. By design, we have a system of separation of powers, and by design, we provide, for example, the United States Senate. Two senators come from the state of Wyoming with 500,000 people, and two senators come from California with 35 million people. And so there are already built in a set of institutions that slow the reflection of the popular will. But what's made it worse is, for example, the application of the filibuster, this quirk of history that now essentially creates a supermajority requirement for any legislation passing through the Senate and passing through Congress. That's something that's probably going to have to change in order for us to do something big in this country. But the other set of problems are really cultural and go beyond politics. It's been called the Great Sort, but in our country right now, each side has become so divided, not just along racial lines or religious lines, but also geographic lines, the difference between how the metropolitan areas vote versus the rural votes. And what's probably most damaging, and I talk about this in the book repeatedly, each of these sides now have their own media, and as a consequence, their own facts. And it's very hard to compromise if you're not working off a common reality. So when Donald Trump asserts that there was an election full of fraud, despite the fact that no one can find any example of fraud, even the local Republican officials say, no, this was a very normal election. And yet you have millions of people now who believe there was fraud because that's what they're hearing, not just from Donald Trump through his tweets, but also on Fox News and also from talk radio and Rush Limbaugh. And when you have that kind of detachment from facts, then it becomes very difficult to compromise. So how we fix that, that's going to be a long-term project. That's not something that one election will fix. And I think Joe will do his best to reach out to Republicans. There may be areas where we can arrive at some compromise. There's still 2 Senate seats that have yet to be determined in Georgia, and if Democrats won both those seats, then you would have a Democrat in Democratic control of the Senate, but just barely. If not, you'll have Mitch McConnell, and he undoubtedly will block a lot of things that Joe wants to do. So we're going to have to work through this, and which is why I say this election at least stops the bleeding. It allows us to shift and remind the world and ourselves of what we stand for. But in terms of doing big things, we're going to have to find a way to break this very deep division, and that is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to take some years.
Mr. President, let's talk about your presidency. You had big challenges. You talk about them in the book, the Recovery Act, the financial crisis. What do you consider the 3 most or the 3 best accomplishments of your presidency, and the 3 failures or shortcomings?
I try to emphasize in this book how close we came to a global depression, not just a Great Recession. And I continue to be very proud of the fact that we stopped the world from slipping into a much worse economic situation. It still was painful, and we still paid a political price because unlike FDR, Franklin Roosevelt came in when the Depression had been going on for 3 years. So everybody was very clear who was at fault, and he was able to come in and start fresh. With me, we came in just as things were getting bad. People didn't really understand how bad they were. And the fact that we stopped it from completely dropping meant that people were just frustrated that it wasn't getting better faster. But I think we did a good job there. The Paris Accords were not sufficient to solve climate change, but it created an architecture internationally that for the first time said, we're all responsible, we all have a role to play, including countries like China that previously had said, this is not our fault that the atmosphere is getting warmer. So it's all up to the Europeans and the Americans and the Japanese to do something. So getting Chinese agreement, Indian agreement, Brazil, other countries to say, yes, we are part of the solution.
You had to do some gangster shit.
Yeah. We had some unconventional negotiations to make that to help make that happen. That laid the predicate for Paris. I think that was something I'm very proud of.
And what about the failures?
Well, I've got to say, the Affordable Care Act established the baseline in this country that should have been done decades ago, because every other advanced country recognized this, that everybody should have health care in a country as wealthy as ours. We didn't get it all done. In terms of failures, I think that there is no doubt that I was not able to transfer my own popularity to my party, and so as a consequence, after my first 2 years, Democrats didn't do that well. Even when I won for re-election, we didn't win back Congress. And what that meant was that I was more constrained in terms of passing laws in this country than I would have liked. I think that on the foreign policy front, I'm still haunted by the tragedy of Syria. That's going to be discussed mostly in volume 2 of the book because it primarily happens in my second term, but it's hinted at because the Arab Spring, which I discuss extensively, when a lot of the focus at that time was on Egypt and then later on Libya. But in fact, that was the moment when Syria begins to unravel. I'll have to make sure that people buy the second volume, so I can't tell you exactly what I think about all that. But obviously, not being able to mobilize the international community to hold that country together and lessen the human suffering, I think, is something I still think about.
I'd like to hear a little bit about you personally. When I read the book, I saw very much that your childhood already, you were very much influenced by women, your mother and your grandmother, later, of course, also by your wife, your children, and other strong women that you worked with. But at the same time, you realized at a very early age that you were different skin color. You had a different upbringing. You lived in a different country for quite a long time. And not having that ordinary American background gave you, I think, a very different perspective on America. So what would you say, which influences were pivotal for you in becoming a politician?
Well, one of the central themes of the book is my belief that America is exceptional, but not because it has the biggest military, not because it's wealthy. What makes America exceptional is the fact that we are perhaps the first great power in history where our population is made up of people that come from everywhere, that has had to wrestle with the issues of race and differences of religion and different ethnic groups and customs and cultures, and tried to hold that all together democratically. And I think the reason that I ended up getting into politics, as I explained, is that I had to find a way to explain my own life with all these different strands and all these different cross currents. A white mother from Kansas, a black father from Kenya, living in Asia, a half-sister who's half Indonesian. And so I thought to myself, well, if I want to be whole and have a place for myself where I don't have to choose between tribes, then I have to work in order to make America, the idea of America, as a place where we are no longer a collection of tribes conflicting and trying to defeat each other, but rather we are part of one people. That in my own imagination becomes part of my own identity, that project of building a common identity around a common humanity. And initially it wasn't politics that I thought was elected politics that I thought was going to be the avenue for that. I was much more inspired by the civil rights movement and social movements like Solidarity and Nelson Mandela.
And that's where you started working at.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it was only later that I thought, well, there were no great social movements at the time that I left school. I learned a lot working at a grassroots level. That is my orientation. But at some point I decided, I will try to work within the system rather than from outside the system.
Mr. President, your book comes across as very honest. It's a self-examination as a husband, as a father, and as a president. in a very moving episode, you describe the shame you felt being busy with your grand pursuits when your mother died. Very moving indeed. And you ask, was I just trying to fill a hole in myself doing all this, or did I try to help the maximum number of people? Do you have an answer now?
It's interesting, because Michelle and I have talked about this. I think one of the things I've learned as I've gotten older, I think part of growing up and becoming an adult is recognizing that you can't help but start off with various impulses and ideas that come out of your past, right? Your background, your relationship with your parents, traumas you may have experienced. And so there's no doubt that part of me initially going into public life, into politics, wanting to achieve, wanting to do big things, probably has to do with the fact that my father wasn't there. It has to do with the fact that I was an outsider, and that I didn't always have a sense of belonging, right? But as you get older, what you realize is, the question is isn't what your initial motivations were, but rather what did you do with them? And I feel that I took those issues of mine, whatever hole I had in my heart, whatever fueled me in my ambitions, that I steered them in a healthy way. That at the end of the day, rather than deciding I'm going to prove myself by making as much money as I can, or I'm going to prove myself by trying to dominate others, that I'm going to prove myself by seeing how many people I can help. And I quote in the book a famous speech by Dr. Martin Luther King called the drum major instinct. And in America we have parades, and there's somebody at the front who's leading the parade. That's called the drum major. And he says everybody wants to be first. Everybody wants to lead the parade. He said, that's an inherent human instinct, right? We want to be seen and be important. And the question is, can you lead in service? Can you be first in helping others? It's a way of channeling those impulses in a way that hopefully are helpful rather than destructive. And I'd like to think I figured that out at some point along the way.
Talking to the German media, we have to apologize, but of course we would also be interested in your opinion on certain, not just mainly one topic about Germany. I had the feeling when I read your description of when you went on foreign trips, you really enjoyed going out, leaving the Washington bubble, I don't say the swamp, leaving Washington and everything that is around here. And you met a lot of politicians from India to China, and also you met German Chancellor Angela Merkel. When you look at her now and what she has done and how you have interacted with her, what do you think of her now? She's entering her last year in her chancellorship, and what do you think what the German role should be in the future?
I've said this publicly before. I am very fond of Angela Merkel. She is, I think, been an outstanding leader, not just for Germany, but for Europe and for the world. And I'll undoubtedly discuss her more in the second volume of the book, because a lot of the things we worked on and our relationship deepened as time went on. As I mentioned initially, I think she was a little skeptical of me. She says, I don't trust people who...
Yeah, I don't want him to speak at the Brandenburg Gate. Yeah. Still, 200.
And we had some disagreements early on in terms of economic policy, because I think she reflected the German view, in part grounded in German history, that excessive spending and you know, deficit spending is bad, and I was trying to make the argument that, look, when you're in the middle of a economic crisis and recession, then we need counter-cyclical spending, and so we'd have these debates. But throughout, she was somebody who was steady, smart, focused. I think, as I write in the book, she's instinctually, I think, kind and a good person. And her leadership through so many crises in Europe made her a very important partner. And I trusted her completely. There were never moments when we interacted where I felt as if she wasn't trying to do what was right, and that she would be honest with me about what she could and couldn't do. She's a good politician. I think there were times where, on foreign policy issues or economic issues, she'd have to explain to me, these are my constraints in terms of what the German people accept. I talk about the Greek
financial crisis,
crisis, and I was pushing Europe as a whole, and Angela in particular, that, look, you can't just let Greece collapse because the economy is too fragile right now, and obviously she had to reflect the views of the Bundestag and the German people, that why are we bailing out Greece for their problems? And but she I think has been very, very important in maintaining European solidarity and the European idea, and resisting a return to the kinds of toxic nationalism that tore Europe apart for centuries. And she will be missed. I'm glad that she was going to leave earlier. I think because of the pandemic, she decided to stay. Her performance during the pandemic is what I would expect from her. It was based on facts. It was clear. She was honest with people. Not only do I think was she an outstanding partner for me, I think she has been a great leader for Germany and for Europe as a whole.
Mr. President, you are the man of change. Are you still hungry for a change, or does this wear off with age?
No, well, look, I am actually hungry for change. I just may not always be the agent of change, right? So part of the reason that the Obama Foundation is focused on young people is my belief that it's good for new blood to enter the political process, new voices. I had my moment in the sun. I'm proud of what we accomplished. My most important task now is not to try to stay leading the parade myself, but helping talented, idealistic young people to get out there and lead the parade. And I don't mind being a mentor and a follower of this next generation, because I think their instincts are good, not just here in the United States, but around the world. Even when I was president, I would do town hall meetings with young people. The first one I did, actually, I think, was in Germany.
In Strasbourg, I think, on the border, yeah.
Yeah, we had, I think, 1,000 young college students from various parts of Europe. And I made that a custom as I was traveling, because I would just love being in a conversation with them. And they are smart, they are idealistic. I think they have very sophisticated views. They instinctively believe in the dignity of all people. They understand the need for environmental sustainability. And the problem is that they mistrust existing institutions. They don't see how they serve their views and their interests. And what I say to young people is, you can change those institutions, but you have to participate. You have to be involved. And that's what I want to encourage. And And somebody's asked me, who was I writing this book for? And it's really for those young people. Part of the reason I write this book, not just as a dry history of my presidency, but as a journey of me as a young man ending up being president, and then the work of the presidency, is because I want young people to understand there's no magic to this. This isn't something that is separate from their lives. I'm not so different from who they are. And if they make a decision that they want to make a difference, they can too. And I hope that maybe the book provides them a little bit of a roadmap, a little bit of a travel guide for what their own lives can be if they choose to commit themselves to something larger than themselves.
Okay, we're running out of time. I know one last question, perhaps. I was chuckling because when you were sworn in for office at the State Senate of Illinois, a reporter asked you, Mr. Obama, what do you consider your place in history? And I think you shrugged it off. I don't think you gave him an answer.
Well, I had just been elected.
So how would you answer that question now? What is your place in history?
I think that's something that you have to leave to the historians to answer. I'm not even sure that you can have perspective on it right now. What I can say with confidence is that America and the world were better off when I left office than when I came into office. And I'm proud of that. And what that tells me then is that I ran my leg of the race well. I've come to think of the presidency as a relay race. You take the baton from somebody and you run your leg, and then you have to pass the baton. And I think I ran my leg of the race reasonably well, and I think what I'm proud of, Michelle and I talk about this. I'm very proud of the fact that we did so with integrity. There weren't scandals. I didn't feel as if I violated my values. I certainly had changed because of the experience, but I did not feel as if who I was essentially had been distorted or destroyed by the very strange experience of being the so-called leader of the free world. And that's reflected, I think, in our children, which is a great blessing. My daughters are wonderful, normal. They're not entitled, they're not spoiled, they're kind, they're thoughtful, they're engaged. Mainly that's because of Michelle and my mother-in-law, but I take a little bit of credit for it as well.
Yeah, you should.
What would young Barack Obama think of the almost 60-year-old now? What do you think the idealistic...
I'm sure he'd be critical of some compromises I made, some decisions I made. I'd like to think that he would say I'd set a pretty good example. And he'd wonder why I decided not to dye my hair.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.